Welcome, Senator, to Okeechobee, though it be virtually. We are honored to have you with us here today. And I'd already given out a few housekeeping rules for all of our guests that are on, so that there's no background noise. Please make sure that you're all muted so that we're hearing just from the Senator. And if something happens to go by in our background, we will just kind of bear with that. But Senator, I'm Paulette, Executive Director for the Chamber of Commerce. With me today, I have Tabitha Trent, who is our president for the Chamber, a longtime friend as well. And we will be co-moderating all of the questions today. But before we begin, I really just want to take a moment to thank you for the partnering with all of our chambers across the state of Florida. We need that. We appreciate that. Thank you so much for having our back and working so diligently with us. But I also want to thank you for being on the Small Business Committee and how hard that you're working to try to find ways that are possible to help our small businesses succeed. For they are the lifeblood of our community, and without them, our communities just will not thrive. And I know that you're aware of that. I know our time is short, so I want to go ahead and take just a few moments to have you give us your thoughts about what we need to know before we start with the questions. And again, I know you've got a busy schedule, so thank you so very much.
No, it's my honor. It's my job to be with you here today, and I'm glad to be able to do it. And I don't need to tell you what all the uncertainty that's out there now that's facing us on multiple fronts. There's virtually no aspect of our lives that hasn't been impacted by it. I appreciate your kind words about the work on small business. Our goal early on was we understood that there was a lot of small businesses that were doing well, but from one day to the next sort of found themselves on the doorstep of going out of business forever. And we were concerned about them, but we were concerned about the people working for them. And so we wanted to provide assistance in a way that had never been done before. We didn't really have a mechanism for getting assistance to small business so they can keep their people employed. And a particular challenge in that regard is that small business, while it's a catch-all phrase, it ranges from everywhere from an independent contractor to somebody with 300 employees and everything in between across every sector, every industry with different needs, different economics, paid differently. So it was hard to sort of come up with. We had no way to deliver the money. There was no existing SBA system to do it. And that's why, we came up with PPP that I think by and large was the most successful program of all the ones that were passed in the first round. And we're certainly now hoping to pass a second package of help. It'll be certainly smaller than the first, but it'll have a new element of PPP targeted to, even those who still really need it, those who've had revenue loss and are under a certain size, 300 employees or less across multiple sectors. But also we wanted for the first time ever to include economic development C6s, 501c6s, like local chambers and others who we think are critical to helping our business community sort of recover. And part of that is helping them access the help that's out there, the programs that are out there, navigate all of it. It can be intimidating and complicated, especially for really small and micro businesses to do so. So there's a lot going on. Obviously, I think this time is probably best spent answering your questions and the questions that you have, but I just wanted you to know that, Florida has a very diverse economy, and we thought about that too and how we did this. And when people think of Florida, they think about tourism, and then they think about development because people moving here. But it's important for us to also point out that we have all sorts of other things that power our economy. We have a thriving space industry and aerospace industry. Obviously, agriculture is an enormous part of our state's economy. People don't usually associate Florida as an ag state, but the numbers say it is, and in surprising ways when you talk to people about it nationally. And all of these things are critical. And if any one of these pieces falls, the rest of the economy begins to suffer. And a lot of them are intertwined. Water quality and availability of water are interrelated. And these issues have environmental impacts. They have impacts on visitors and tourism and hospitality, but they also have an impact on the ability to grow things, particularly the things that so many in our country depend on, like winter vegetables and things of that nature. We've been working very closely with Ambassador Lighthizer on some of those issues, and I think we've made a little bit of progress in that regard with an announcement yesterday. There's more to be done. So I'm here to try to answer any questions you have. If we can't get to all of them, obviously, we always tell people to submit them to our folks and we'll get you direct answers, but we're going to try to get as many as we can in the time that we have. And just thank you for the opportunity to do this today.
Well, we thank you as well. And I do want to remind anyone that sent in the questions, if we don't get to them, as you said, we'll make sure that we get them back over to your office, Senator. And anyone that may come up with a question that has not sent it, please make sure that you do so, and I will make sure that it gets over to your office as well. So with that, Tabitha.
Thank you, Paulette. Hello, Senator Rubio. It's an honor to virtually meet you this morning and have you with us. The first
Thank
question,
you. Thank you.
The first question of our Q&A session this morning is, would you please humanize the impact being had on Americans as Congress and the administration failed to provide additional economic relief to individuals, families, members, and states impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I think the best way to talk about it is the businesses that I know, for example, in the hospitality industry, like let's say a restaurant. I have a family-owned restaurant that I know. It's been in this community for a very long time. They faced county restrictions. They had to close. Then they were allowed to reopen at 50% indoors. Then when we had a spike, they were forced to close again. They could continue to serve people outdoors, but their outdoors was basically a blacktop, which is not just viable in this heat and this weather. And this is a 35-year institution that went out of business. So that was a family's work. That was the entire family had worked, or the kids had grown up around that business and had begun to run it themselves, and they were doing just fine in March. I mean, really, just things were going great. They're talking about opening up and to go from March, where you're talking about opening up a new location, to being gone after 35 years was very dramatic. But even more dramatic was the people that worked there. They were left unemployed, and the uncertainty that put on their families. I think about, when we talk about real estate, a lot of people think, oh, these, landlords that own big properties. I know people who have worked their whole lives, and their retirement is invested in 1 or 2 apartment units somewhere that they rent out. And their goal was to retire with maybe a small pension, Social Security, and the income they generate from those units. Well, now they're not generating any rent because the people that live there aren't paying it, and they can't evict them. There's an eviction moratorium. So suddenly they're in a very difficult situation where not only are they not generating income from the property, they're now behind on the mortgage that secured it, that ultimately was supposed to pay itself off during these years. So when they retired, these are people that don't buy stocks and bonds. They want to be able to touch what they own. So there's tremendous uncertainty there. And that's a part of it. So, I mean, we could go on and on. The one thing I am concerned about are the businesses that used PPP to bring employees back, that despite all of this uncertainty, did not want their employees to go away, did not want to lose their employees. Because if you're a small business, the employees are generally not a name on a ledger. They are human beings. Many of them have worked for you for a very long time. You've watched their kids grow up. You've been a part of major events in their families, the ups and the downs. You consider them like family, and you'd want to do everything you can to keep them around. The PPP money has or is about to run out for them, and they have no way to keep these people on. And it's just a matter of time before they have to lay them off if they haven't done so already. And that has a ripple effect. I know just growing up, and the few times my dad lost his job, he was a bartender, and those periods in between, luckily they were not very long, but it's really a very disruptive time for a family, and it goes beyond just a paycheck. And so you think about that, and that's the argument we've been making consistently about at least the need to do PPP reform, and then some of these other things that we're talking about are going to be important as well. Unfortunately, this is caught up in politics, where some people have decided that doing nothing is better for their election prospects in November. I hope that changes. We're going to try. When we get back next Tuesday, we'll be out of recess. We'll be back in DC. We're going to try to pass something that's more targeted, that's a compromise, that we hope can be a compromise, and hopefully we can move forward and do something. We need to, and otherwise people are going to get hurt. They're going to continue to be hurt.
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
And I think our next question said, what impact will these relief packages have on our country as a whole? I think you pretty much already, answered that. It is going to be very difficult, going forward. So thank you.
Okay, regarding PPP, many businesses exhausted that program, and it was designed for initially 8 weeks of payroll, rent, and utilities. Is there going to be any relief for small businesses under 50 employees for them to continue to keep their employees? Perhaps another PPP program, a second round that you mentioned?
Yes, and we've announced that. It's out there. It's going to be a part of whatever compromise is put on the floor. There's not a lot of dispute over it for the most part. I mean, there's some details that need to be worked out, but those are not insurmountable. Largely, it's three things make it different. The maximum loan is still going to be 2.5 times monthly payroll, but the maximum loan is going to be $2 million instead of 10. It's going to be limited for businesses with 300 employees or less instead of 500 or less. And there's going to be some revenue loss test, meaning you're going to have to prove that during some quarter of this year, you lost, right now it's 35% revenue compared to last year. Some want it to get down to 25% because of the margins in some industries are very narrow, but there'll be some revenue test. And the goal in all that, basically, the way it works is they tell us this is how much money we have available for another round of PPP. I think in this case, it's about $250 billion. And then we need to try to cover as many people or many businesses as we can and save as many jobs as we can with that $250 billion. What we don't want to do is have the money run out and have people that need it not get it. And so that's why, these restrictions are in place. We thought for a second round of PPP, it really should be targeted at the businesses that need it the most. As part of that 250, there's about $10 billion that's set aside specifically for companies with 50 employees or less, meaning if all the other money runs out, that money will still be there. In essence, we're trying to make sure that there's a pot of money as part of that overall pot that is reserved for businesses under a certain size so that they're not disadvantaged if a bunch of the firms with 250 or 300 employees jump in and grab the money. We don't want it to be like a free-for-all sort of survival of the fittest type situation. So we do set aside some money within that money for businesses of 50 employees or less specifically.
All right, and then would you support an automatic forgiveness for these PPP loans for nonprofit or businesses with loans that are under some amount, such as 100,000, 200,000?
I mean, theoretically, yes, but it's complicated. And let me explain. The reason why we even have forgiveness in the whole program, in essence, the reason why we don't just make it forgivable at the outset is that the way we've been able to get the votes to pass this and sell it to our colleagues is that this is the Paycheck Protection Program. The argument basically is if you have a person that works somewhere, you have a choice. You can either try to keep them employed through their employer, or they're going to go on the unemployment rolls. Either way, you're going to pay for it. So which is the best way to help them? And the argument we made was the best way to help people, if we're going to get money to them anyways, the best way to do it is through a job. So they're attached to work, as opposed to having them out there in the unemployment system, which has been difficult to access in much of the country because of the volume of people that are trying to get in. So that's why it's a Paycheck Protection Program. The only way we can guarantee that the money is going to be spent on payroll is if you have the prospect that if you don't use it for payroll, it turns into a loan. And if you use it for payroll, it's forgiven. So that's why the forgiveness process needs to exist. So the concern about making that automatic before that first round was fully expended was that somebody would take out a loan for 100,000, not spend it on payroll, and not have to worry about it because it's automatically forgiven anyways. I think now that we have gone through pretty much all of the spending and the 24-week, it was extended from 8 to 24 weeks. I think once we get past that 24-week period for everyone who got PPP, I think then we can discuss that sort of arrangement where we can either really simplify or have a presumption of forgiveness for all the loans under a certain amount. Presumption meaning you don't have to really file any paperwork, but just like they do with taxes, you could be randomly audited. And so everyone has at least some incentive to make sure that they have some paperwork around for a couple of years to prove that they used it for payroll. Those are some of the ideas being floated, but that's the reason why we didn't do that at the front end, because if we did it at the front end, then there was no way to guarantee the money would go to payroll, which is what we told everybody this would be about.
Understand.
Okay, our next question is, what are you doing to help sole proprietors and LLCs? Businesses are able to defer payroll taxes for employees, which also may be forgiven if Trump is reelected. What about the self-employment taxes? The majority of the grants sole proprietors and LLCs received are considered taxable income. These business owners are struggling to stay afloat, and a tax burden in 2021 could put some businesses out of business. How could you prevent this from happening?
Well, a couple of things. The first is that on the deferral of the payroll, I think everyone appreciates the gesture, and it may work for some. It gives you some flexibility, but ultimately you're going to owe it. And at some point, people are going to owe it. You're going to have to come back and pay for it later. And so I think many would rather just pay it. If they're going to have to pay it anyway, they'd rather pay it now than have this liability sitting out there down the road around their necks. So I'm not sure any people will be helped by that, although I think a lot of people are appreciative of the effort the White House made. And again, they did it because Congress didn't pass anything. So they were trying to figure out what did they have the executive power to do. On the first point you make about PPP being taxable, that's not in the bill. That's the IRS's interpretation of it, but that's not in the bill. In fact, when we scored the bill, meaning when we asked the Joint Commission to tell us how much it was going to cost, that cost for that program assumed that this would not be taxable income, that it would not be something you could tax people on, and that's the IRS has reached a different interpretation. The IRS is always going to err on the side of revenue. They want to collect. My argument is this is not a real cost, because had it not been for PPP, there would have been nothing to collect. Now, these businesses would have gone out of business. So either way, you should just assume you weren't going to collect it as opposed to making it a taxable event. So what I think is going to have to happen is what Senator Cornyn is proposing and what we are proposing too and supporting, and that is language that makes it explicitly clear that this is not a taxable, it's not taxable income, that's already in the bill, but that you can deduct those expenses. In essence, if you spend it on a deductible expense, they're arguing you can't deduct it and you have to pay taxes on it. We're arguing that you can, because that's what the bill was priced at, assuming that. Now we're just going to have to lay it out clearly in the bill, and that's our hope that we're going to be able to do when we get the next crack at it here, whether it's next Tuesday or whenever the second round of support passes. But we'll have to do it before the end of the calendar year or the end of the tax year, because people need to start filing in January and they need to know the answer to that.
Okay, and then Senator, what are your thoughts on the Rural Communications Act of 2019?
Well, I think that continues to work its way through. We have some real challenges in that regard, and part of it, frankly, has been, so much now of commerce has continued to move in the direction of online and telecommunications, and it really so much of our lives, whether it's the ability to go to school at this point, the ability to transact all sorts of things. So, our hope is that we can continue to focus on this issue beyond just the bill and those proposals. I mean, people forget, but this country undertook a massive effort to electrify and provide electricity to much of our country at the turn in first quarter of the last century, when electricity was still not widely available in many parts of this country. I think we need to have a similar effort in rural areas across this country where there's a real growing digital divide that's created a tremendous impediment to economic growth and development. And it's not like the trend lines are moving away. They're everything, commerce, banking, emergency services, everything is moving into the realm of the digital. And that's only going to expand even more in the years to come. In fact, the pandemic has accelerated that. And so we leave huge swaths of the country geographically isolated if we don't have it in place. And the challenges are that the economics of telecommunication in this country are largely built around volume in dense areas, as opposed to having to provide services across broader areas. So what that means is we're going to have to figure out cost-effective ways. You don't want to call it a subsidy, but in essence, that some government assistance in the way we calculate for all this to make it cost-effective for private providers to expand the bandwidth, the broadband capabilities, the availability of spectrum. Because the other challenge that's happening is, the more and more that comes online, the more of our existing capacity is used up. And of course, all that is being used up in places with heavy volume, the more expensive it becomes to provide these services in rural areas across the country. So this is a growing problem that is only accelerated because of the pandemic. So I hope we can move just even beyond that and have a more holistic approach to what we need to do regarding the digital divide. We do have digital deserts in this country who, it's not like you have zero access, but you don't have the same access as some other areas, and the cost, per access is more expensive for slower responses. And the result is that it's going to begin to really create pockets of economic disadvantage.
Okay, thank you.
Our next question is in regards to daylight savings time. Will that be changing or staying the same all year?
My hope is that we can pick one time and stick with it the whole year. There really is no rationale any longer for the flipping of the back and the forth of time. Look, it's not the major issue facing the Republic. Okay, I'm not saying that our country's future hinges on it, but I do think there's a good question to be asked about why we continue to do it. There's actually some interesting health studies out there about the impact that this has, not just the switch, but one time versus another. But a lot of there are some people that feel very strongly about daylight savings time. The reason why I filed this bill is because the intent of the Senate, when the Senate was created by our founders, it was designed to represent the states. In fact, for much of our history, senators were directly elected, not by the public, but by the legislature. Obviously, that has changed, but nonetheless, the role of the Senate in representing the state to me is very important. Our state legislature passed with pretty strong bipartisan support a bill to go to one standard time, and so I felt like they felt so strongly about it. It was my job as the senator representing the state to make that available. I've been surprised at the amount of support we've picked up over time, including the president himself has said he's for it. So the challenge with that issue is, frankly, that it's important enough for us to talk about it here today, but it's not important enough for anyone to sort of stop everything else we're doing to deal with it. But I do hope we can find a fix to it. I'm not saying it's going to change the world or solve any of our other problems. I just think it's hard to continue to justify why we keep doing it. But my preference is we just pick one and stick with it. I believe we're one of the few countries in the world that does this, and the justifications for it just don't exist any longer, in my view.
Very good, very good. Our next question is from our agricultural community partners. Lake Okeechobee has taken a lot of heat from environmentalists. They put the blame for this on the ranchers, farmers, and dairymen, and that has been proven to be incorrect. What is being done to protect our food producers from being pushed out or overregulated so they have a hard time and they have to stop using their own land?
Yeah, well, this problem started over a century ago when there was decisions made with regards to the Everglades based on the engineering and science they had available to them at the time. You know, the headwaters of the Everglades begins just north of Lake Okeechobee. And what happened over time is not only was the water flow to the south restricted as a result of some of these decisions, but development came in north of the lake. And with development comes people, obviously, and with people comes nutrients that go into the ground, be it septic tanks, fertilizers, golf courses, resorts, and the like. That water flows south, and that is where the nutrient load is largely coming from into Lake Okeechobee. So the answer to that problem that some have on their minds is, well, we just need to create a bunch of reservoirs. And by the way, it happens to be agricultural land. So let's put agriculture out of business and let's turn it all into a place to hold water where we can clean it and then send it south. That just, number one, these are real human beings. These are communities. These are livelihoods. These are jobs. And this is a critical need for our country. Agriculture is a critical component of our economy, but is also a critical component of our national economy. So the answer is not that. The answer is to figure out a way to do that, to achieve what it is they're talking about, which is the ability to send more clean water south without flooding people's land, basically, without allowing entire segments of our state to turn into big reservoirs and put these industries out of business. And so people have approached it in different ways in the past. They've tried to tax industries out of business 20 years ago with a ballot initiative. They've tried to regulate it out of business. They've tried to create plans to buy up a bunch of this land to make it virtually impossible for anyone else to operate. You see efforts from time to time to interfere with the way water is managed out of the lake in ways that potentially threaten us during drought conditions from having enough water available. I think we need to be driven by the fact that, like any state and any people, we have to act in the common good. And the common good is we want to take care of our natural environment. No, we don't like the fact that there are algae blooms, but the only way you solve that problem is, number one, by dealing with the cause of it, which is north of the lake. It's not primarily agriculture, if at all. And number two is by dealing with it with things that are actually, going to solve it, and that balance all of the different elements of our economy and of our life in the state. So I'm a big believer that we can do this. If you put the politics and the noise aside, we can have a state in which our water quality and availability improves without having to flood people's land and putting them out of business.
Thank you very much. And of course, we all feel for that, definitely. We also have questions that's been asked. I'd like to know who's in charge of Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Committee. They have to have someone to answer to. It seems like there's an agenda to destroy all invasive plants in some areas or lakes, but not in others. The spraying of chemicals of any kind in any amount can't be good for short or long term, no matter what science says. With all the focus on clean water and the Everglades restoration, of course, those projects. It just doesn't make sense to chemically kill vegetation in the name of invasive plants. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's obviously a state entity. It's almost a semi-autonomous board appointed, I believe, by the governor and state legislative leaders. So they operate much like water management districts do. They're not directly accountable to anyone other than the appointees that are on the board have tremendous power to make decisions. But they're appointed by elected officials to be on there. They're not elected onto it. As I said, that's not, I mean, with the federal government's role in this sometimes is actually unique, because there are times where in order to comply with one federal regulation, you have to violate another federal regulation, or times when in order to comply with a federal mandate, you have to violate a state one, or vice versa. And clearly the EPA is involved in sort of some of the chemicals you can use or not use and how much and where. And then we have some court rulings as well. But I can't speak in great depth about that. I haven't dealt with a Fish and Wildlife Commission for a long time. I know some of the people that are on there, but your question was about accountability. Their decisions are made by a board that's appointed by elected officials at the state level. And so ultimately, I would say if there is accountability, it is to the people who appointed them, who can also replace them.
All right, thank you, sir.
And our next question is also in reference to the lake. Senator Rubio, how can you help us in getting more positive publicity and education to the general public as to the health of the lake and the great fishing that is currently taking place in a proactive manner? Why is it always the lake's fault for algae blooms, even though the locks have been closed and no water has been flowing in the eastern direction? Nothing is ever said about this in a positive light, only negative. Please help us.
Well, I think one of the challenges we have, and I hope that begins to change, is that a lot of the coverage of some of this issue is driven by the places that are impacted by it, but are far from where the lake is. I think you also have a lot of interest groups involved who clearly have a narrative that they promote, and they're very effective at it. And they have found allies both on television stations and the broader media in terms of how it's reported on. So that's really been a challenge, and that continues to be a challenge. I think there's been some progress made. I've seen some serious reporting done over the last couple of years that really details the nuances involved in all of this, including the fact that, as you say, some of that nutrient load that is creating these algae blooms have nothing to do with the lake. It has to do with local conditions, whether it's old septic tanks that are seeping or along the pathway. I mean, it's a multifaceted problem. But I really think it begins with sort of having a consistent argument made across the board that this is should not be an us versus them, that there are two or different types of communities that are impacted here. They both deserve the right to live, to prosper. As people have a right to their property rights and to utilize it that way, and that there's a way to balance these interests. But it has been frustrating in the past because a lot of the coverage of this issue is dominated in many cases and in many markets by individuals that cover it solely from an environmental standpoint, which is fine, except that it doesn't account for other factors that, by the way, I think are tied to the environment too. Agriculture depends on the environment. And in essence, I know of no industry that has a higher and more vested interest in preserving the natural environment than agriculture. Because if you don't preserve the natural environment, nothing grows, nothing prospers. You can't have an agricultural community. Now, you mentioned an agricultural industry. You mentioned about the fishing and the tourist opportunities that are there. I think that's an important story to tell as well. I mean, the lake is not just a source of bad news, the way people always constantly describe it as a problem. It is a natural body of water. It's been there before any of us were here. And it brings with it some real opportunity as well to be something we feature as a state, as a place that people can visit and enjoy, a key part of our ecosystem that we should be proud of. And I do think there need to be better efforts done to talk about it in that way.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, question here. Do you support PBM legislation that regulates pharmacy benefit managers such as CVS Caremark and Express Scripts so that independent pharmacies and patients in rural communities like Okeechobee are protected from the predatory tactics used by these PBMs? If yes, do you support eliminating the DIR fees, direct and indirect remuneration fees?
Yeah, and I don't know if I can get into that level of detail simply because that's not an issue. I mean, at that micro level of the specific fees and how they're charged, it's something that we need to know a little bit more about before I can give you a specific answer on it. But I can tell you this about what we call the middleman broker. A lot of people think they're buying their drug directly from the maker. They're not. And what's become concerning, and it's continued to grow into how this industry has been centralized, is that in many cases, both the benefit manager and the retail side are the same company. So they're making money twice on it. They're making it both as the person moving the drugs, and they're also making it at the retail point of sale. So all of that, every one of these points is adding costs to the availability of to the cost of medicine. You speak about independent pharmacies. You know, independent pharmacies have been under assault now for 20 years, like many other sectors of the economy have, because when you have, as an example, again, this is sort of a more urban setting, but in South Florida, virtually all of our independent pharmacies are gone now, because all it takes is a Walgreens, a CVS, or a Walmart, for that matter, or even a Target to open up nearby, and the sheer volume that they're able to generate, along with all the other services they wrap around it, make it almost impossible for you to stay in business. So in any sector of the economy in which you have less people involved, in which you start to consolidate volume in the hands of just a handful of operators, costs are going to go up that go beyond just the price of the drug. It goes to all the costs that are embedded in between the consumer and the end user. And that's really concerning moving forward, because more and more of our medical innovations are moving into the pharmaceutical realm. You're going to see less and less invasive therapies over time, and more conditions that can be treated pharmaceutically. So again, and you're going to have a record number of people at an age in which they're going to be using a lot of pharmaceuticals, and they're going to be living longer, hopefully healthier lives. So this whole industry is going to be a bigger chunk of our cost of living than it's ever been before in the history of the world. And we have to deal with the price points here on it. So whatever the impediments are to having an efficient market that can deliver the medicine to the consumer at the lowest possible cost without compromising availability, without compromising safety and efficacy, is something that we'd be very supportive of. But it's a very Byzantine system. There is no simple one bill answer to it. It involves a real, careful thinking of it. And frankly, there's politics involved too. And these are powerful companies who spend a lot of time, money, and energy to sort of protect their market share. But it is a problem. The existence of these beneficiary managers is a problem, particularly when they aren't just a manager, they're also on the retail side of it. So that they almost double dip into it.
Well, thank you, Senator. I know you've got several other calls after this one. We appreciate your time, and we appreciate all that you're doing for the chambers, for our small businesses, amongst all those other worthy causes that you're diligently working on. We pray that you're going to stay strong, continue to fight for what's right, and be our advocate for a positive promotion of our Great Lake Okeechobee and our amazing community. But thank you so very much for spending a little bit of your time with us today. We're honored.
Thank you. Thank you. You can count on us continuing to fight for you. We're very proud of the Lake region and all the counties that surround it and all the industries that depend on it. And we think you have a very bright future, and we want to be a part of it. So thank you for having me a part of this today.
And we certainly hope to see you in person sometime soon.
I know.
Thank you.
Very soon.
We can definitely get you out fishing. I know we've got several guides, so just let us know when you're coming.
You don't need to ask twice. We look forward to that.
All right. I expect a date.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Thank you.